Now we want to turn our attention back to Switzerland and more details on the deal struck between the U.S. and China in some marathon talks over the weekend, suspending most of the tariffs on each other's goods for 90 days while the two sides, they continue their negotiations. The U.S. will lower its so-called reciprocal tariffs on Chinese goods from 125% down to 10%. The U.S. trade rep now says the effective rate on most Chinese imports, it now stands at 30%. China will also lower its tariff rate on U.S. products down to 10%. U.S. tariffs related to fentanyl and other measures, those will remain in place. The two countries say they have a quote-unquote mechanism to continue discussions over the economy and trade relations. Treasury Secretary Bessent speaking this morning.
Neither side wants a decoupling. And what had occurred with these very high tariffs, as Ambassador Greer said, was the equivalent of an embargo, and neither side wants that. We do want trade. We want more balanced trade, and I think that both sides are committed to achieving that.
All right, let's get more reaction to all of this now with Carlos Gutierrez, former U.S. Commerce Secretary under President George W. Bush. He is also a CNBC contributor. Carlos, good morning. It's great to have you on a morning like this.
Morning, Frank.
All right, so last time you joined us, you told us that your forecast was for tariffs to drop dramatically in the second half of the year. Is this what you had in mind, a pause with a mechanism in place?
Well, one way or the other, I thought the tariffs would be lower in the second half of the year, and that's where they're trending. And it looks like 10% is kind of a magical point, and that's probably something that will stay, kind of a permanent 10% tariffs with the flexibility to move up if something happens, if something warrants it. There'll be some countries that stay with the tariffs, but I think that will be exceptions. And we have to keep our eye on the top 15, the top 18, the negotiations. This meeting with China, I thought was great. It's a great start. It's great news. The fact that we've taken away most of the reciprocal tariffs, in fact, we took them all away and just kept 10% and 20% for fentanyl, that's a great start. You know, people are saying maybe it'll come down to 50. Maybe the president said down to 80. So this is above expectations and a very good signal that these talks are off to a good start.
Yeah, we're certainly seeing the market reaction right now. We've been focusing on this all morning long. We're looking at the Dow up about 2%, the S&P up about 2 3/4%, the Nasdaq up about 3 3/4% as well. I want to go back to this. So you said it was 10% tariffs. In all fairness, it's 30% at the effective rate. The 20% tariffs that were previously announced also stay in place. What does that mean in your mind when it comes to trade between these two countries? Is 30%, is that tolerable in your mind?
Yeah, it's 10% based and 20% for fentanyl, and that gives us the 30. So it sets up a potential negotiation for fentanyl, and I would guess that that's probably the next big step, the next big agreement.
But look, Carlos, in all fairness, we don't know how that's going to turn out. That seems to be rather subjective. It seems to be the administration's view on China's efforts to reduce the shipment of fentanyl. But let's just say it stays at 30, because that's what we know for right now. In your mind, what does that mean for the economy? What does that mean for trade between these two countries, the U.S. and China? What does that mean for U.S. companies?
Well, 30 is better than 145. But no, 30 isn't ideal. The thing about 145 is we were headed toward decoupling. That was the next, the next step was a decoupling. 30 is not ideal. 20 is better and 10 is better. So we'd want to see that coming down. I do believe because fentanyl is subjective, that may be an easier deal to reach.
Okay.
Around, controls and potentially putting more controls in China. So that could be something, again, that would be a major win for the president. But now there's this mechanism, and I think that will ensure that there's an ongoing dialogue and there's a rhythm to these talks.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you about. A mechanism. What does that mean in your experience when we're talking about a mechanism? Because it's not a framework, it's not a deal, it's a mechanism.
We used to have something called the Joint Commission on Commerce and Trade, and that was stopped some time back, but it was on for many years, and that was a kind of a day-to-day discussion about issues of the day, tactics, industries, companies, trade problems. Then there was the strategic and economic dialogue, which was more about the longer-term policy. This is probably a combination of the two, although I would see it more in the JCCT area, solving specific problems. We'd have those twice a year. There's no reason why this couldn't be done once a month. So, or even on an ongoing basis. So I think it's very positive. I think that's the kind of thing that we're lacking with China, a specific dialogue, a mechanism to be able to talk. So it's a positive. I think it's a very positive.
What does this say to you about other trade agreements? Again, we have a pause on reciprocal tariffs on a number of other countries that expires in about 60 days from now. There's potential for some negotiations with the EU as well. These talks in Switzerland, the way that they went, and they were relatively quick if you see them meeting over the weekend and coming to some type of at least temporary deal. Does that signal anything to you about the other negotiations that are still to come?
It's a good question. It could spark other countries to move quicker. If there's a deal with China, that means the president is in a deal-making mode, so we should move forward. We should try to get our own deal. So yes, this could be a good spark. We should keep in mind the UK is probably the easiest of all because we started that when Brexit came on, and so it's been happening. And we have a surplus with the UK, so it wasn't as contentious. The remaining 15 or 18 will be a lot tougher. But the important thing, and I think we had talked about this before, is having a kind of a conceptual term sheet. These will not be full-blown agreements. An agreement will take 12 months or so. But having a conceptual term sheet of the issues that will be addressed, I think that will be a major positive. But from here on, I think the important thing will be what you just said, those 15, 18 agreements with the other countries. If there can be a substantial number of those announced, that would be a major boost for the markets. And then, of course, the two remaining things, taxes and regulations, I believe will be a big positive.
All right, former Commerce Secretary Carlos Gutierrez, I want to give you credit. You forecasted there was going to be some movement coming up in the back half of the year, happened even earlier than you expected, but always great to have your insight on a day like this.
Thanks, Frank. I enjoyed talking to you. Thank you.
Carlos, always good to see you. Thank you. Also, we want to give you a quick programming note. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, he's going to have much more on the China trade talks coming up on Squawk Box at 7 a.m. Eastern. He's coming from Switzerland, fresh off of these talks. He's going to be live here on CNBC and CNBC Plus. You do not want to miss this interview.